I am going to keep admitting everyone as they start joining, but since we have a little bit of, you know, cleaning up at the beginning of this webinar before I introduce our rock star speaker for today, I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. A few things that I'm going to just say right off the bat is one, this is being recorded just so we can send out what Carl talks about today to our entire, data science education community after we're done for those that couldn't attend in person. Um, and Carl is really excited to talk about what he is going to be talking about today. Also, we will have time for questions. So if you have anything that comes up um, during something that he is covering, please just go ahead and pop any question that you have in the chat. And we will have people that are going to be monitoring the chat and pulling those questions for the end. So the more interaction, the better. Please don't be shy. And if you, for some reason, internet cuts out or whatever, we also will be sending everyone on this call the recording. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off for this evening. Um, I guess I should start off by saying hi. I am really excited to have everyone on. I know it's Webinar Wednesday, which is exciting, but it's also probably the end of most people's workday. So I really appreciate everyone's time and commitment. Um, Today, our webinar is called Student Data Equals Student Empowerment. We're going to talk about crafting data-driven narratives from student data where we can work to reimagine how we currently use the formative assessment strategies we have. Um, so again, while we wait for more people to join, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. My name is Hannah Kurzweil. I am the community manager for Data Science for Everyone, and I am really excited to have Carl here. I have seen firsthand the benefits of student inclusion when you introduce them to their own data and how they're learning. And I really want to learn more about it from someone who has tackled this head on. So before we dive in, I'm going to do a little bit of background on Data Science for Everyone in case we have some new people here. Data Science for Everyone is a national coalition that works to bring data science education and data literacy into every K-12 classroom. We have grown and grown and grown, very proud over the years, and have a lot of educators that we're working with in all different states and state educational agencies and districts. And we really work on four main pillars, which you can see on the screen. Um, we like to raise awareness just about data science education in general. We are building community. That's a part of what we're doing here, bringing educators together, learning together. We talk about policy and do policy advocacy. How can we get data science in K-12 classrooms, more of a state level, and then offering resources and support for really anyone that we work with. Just a quick reminder about our community standards. We welcome everyone from all backgrounds and levels of experience to data science education. We love newbies, we love experts, and everyone in between. Just to make sure that the webinar goes smoothly, we do want to make sure that everyone maintains their microphones muted, just so that we don't have a lot of background noise, and make sure that we're dialoguing with respect and, uh, I guess, general awareness that we have people from all different backgrounds that join our webinars. So with that said, I'm now going to launch into tonight's topic. We have Carl Slater here to talk to us. He is a literary assessment coach with the New York City Department of Education. He brings expertise in data-driven educational practices that really help to support teachers and students specifically. He has extensive experience in professional development. He's done curriculum design. He does project management in the educational space. He's developed really innovative approaches on how to use data narratives as formative assessment tools. And I know that like assessment can really be a buzzword topic. And it's really one that we as an organization have been grappling with ourselves, right? When we think about how do we think about formative assessments for data science education? Well, one obvious thing is to just include the students in their own data in terms of learning. So his work focuses on transforming how we understand and use educational data, moving beyond just like test scores and trying to create really meaningful narratives that center the students at the crux of it. And it puts them as an agent in their own learning journey, not just kind of like in the sidecar while a teacher is driving. So, as an educator and a consultant, Carl specializes in assessing student creativity, digital literacy, and fostering a transparent mindset with learning. Many of you may have already read Carl's insightful Edutopia article on data narratives, which is what he's going to speak a little bit more in detail about now. We're dropping a link in the chat. If you haven't got a chance to read the article, I really recommend it. But this is where I first heard of Carl and was like, I need him to come talk with us just because of how he frames this human-centric and effective approach to formative assessment. So he'll be sharing more about how educators can craft these meaningful data stories and narratives that help really actually serve the student, the teachers, their parents, and the administration. Carl holds degrees from Morehouse College and Eastern University. He has earned many certifications in educational assessment and evaluation, and his approach is particularly relevant as we navigate this educational landscape that's increasingly focused on metrics and measurement. His work reminds us that behind every data point, there is a student. They have a unique story, and that involving students in interpreting their own data can really transform how they engage with learning. So, I know that was a lot, but I am very excited for Carl. So please join me in welcoming him as he guides us through what he's learned. Carl, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for the wonderful introduction. I got to steal some of those notes. But thank you everybody as well for tuning in, and also for to Shaya and Matenji for being behind the scenes. And it's a great honor to be here today, sharing some of the work that I've been doing in New York City regarding data narratives. So to sort of set the tone, right, for today's meeting, you know, far too often, classroom data, right, is treated more like a verdict, right? This static, final, detached from lived experiences from students, right? However, scores are reported, right? Spreadsheets are analyzed, conclusions are drawn. But what if data was not a judgment, right? But more of a story, right? So in our session today, right, I hope to reframe data as a narration, right, co-constructed with students. Instead of viewing data as this fixed measurement of ability, right, I invite everyone to see it as an entry point into further inquiry, reflection, and growth, right? So, when students help interpret the data that represents them, right? The numbers themselves gain context, complexity, nuance, color, humanity, right? And hopefully towards at the end of our conversation today, my wish is for everybody to, begin reimagining, right? Shifting from viewing data as this compliance-driven accountability metric, right, to really seeing it as a tool for student voice and agency, right? And along the way, we're also going to share a few strategies to implement these data narratives in your own classroom, right? And then, to also think about strategies that we can, turnkey within a month or so, right? So, very, very simple strategies that we can begin delivering that impact and agency for our learners. So, just jumping into it, right? Going back to that, thinking about that previous slide, what are data narratives? Data narratives in my article, I define as dynamic, evolving stories built with student feedback on classroom data, essentially, right? The data position students as collaborators within our learning, assessment, evaluation cycles, right? And not thinking of students as passive recipients of measurement, right? So again, rather than thinking data as, some finality or, some sort of stopping point, right, in our journey, right? We want to think of narratives as functioning more longitudinally, right? When it comes to formative assessments. Um, we also want to find ways that we can integrate quantitative indicators with qualitative insights, right? That's going to be very much the center of our conversation today. to create holistic pictures around, growth and development over time, right? That longitudinal aspect of it. So, as we're thinking about these data narratives, some of the sort of the key phrases I want us to think about is that, scores, or data, raw data, right, should initiate questions rather than conclude conversations. Um, trends, trends within data should be explored alongside, right, lived experiences, right? That's why we bring the student impact or student feedback and voice into it. Tracking growth over time, not just time, but also context and reflection. And also, creating a space for students to create meaning, right, of their own journey and their own data, locating themselves within the data. Right. So overall, we're thinking about this idea of, shifting the mindset from what does this score, data says about the student, right? We want to shift away from that to really now thinking about, well, what story is unfolding here, right? And how do we shape the next chapter with that young person? So here, on the current slide, I'm showing or we're illustrating a few examples of how I prompt students to be these co-pilots, collaborators within their own data, right? And what you'll see a few characteristics, right, within these three images on the screen. The first one is that I hope to communicate to you is student empowerment, right? Students acting as co-pilots within their learning journey. Right. We want the students to interpret based on their own data, right? We want them to interpret patterns, questions, assumptions, reflect on what the data means and in context to their experiences, right? So we're really digging into that cognitive awareness, thinking about thinking, right? Um, Creating a structure so that students have ownership over their own goal setting, right? And confidence navigating feedback, right? I'm sure we all have encountered people who, continue to struggle with this idea of navigating feedback. And, data narratives is this sort of strategy that I use to, acclimate learners to receive feedback and take away from it the things that, speak to them in a way that will allow them to grow as expert learners. Right. We're also looking at this idea of contextual insight, right? So when the student voice is included, right, the story behind the numbers becomes visible, right? So like in my article, I mentioned this idea of, if you ever witness a dip in performance, right, within our classroom assessments, or maybe it could be an exit ticket or a quiz, and you notice that the students overall did not perform as well as normal or as well as you expected, right? We take a step back and we say, okay, well, what else is happening here, right? What are the external factors that are contributing to to this performance? Right. And sometimes, and also in addition to those external factors, right, we also have to be mindful that, sometimes students just want to reclaim their time, right? They may need a moment or two to, you know, reconfigure, recalibrate themselves before tuning back into to learning, right? So, these are just one of the many questions that we can ask ourselves when we incorporate student voice into these data narratives. And then the last point I want to make on this slide is this idea that, we are bringing visibility, right, and dignity to the students' stories, in which case data becomes, a mirror for students' self-reflection on their own progress and their own work, right? A map for providing directional guidance for growth, right? Or it could be a lantern, right? Or all three, right? A lantern, I say, as far, guiding further inquiry, right? What else is happening beyond the data? So, going back to my main focus, right? Instead of labeling ability, right? Instead of using data to label ability, right? We want data to support humanity, dignity, right? So then students are not just reduced to metrics, but they're seen as sort of expert thinkers along the way in that process with us. Next slide, please. The different audiences for data narratives, right? So we can all agree that data narratives benefit the entire community, right? Not just the school. However, in think scoping it within the school community, right? Three groups engage with data narratives most directly, right? So we can see that on the next slide. And that essentially is the students, teachers, and leaders, right? School leadership. Um, but nonetheless, right, across all audiences, right, thinking about parents and guardians and other community stakeholders, right, the aim is to shift from ranking and judgment to now reflection, empathy, and growth, right? So when we're looking at the students, right, the students as the data narrative audience, we're inviting the students into the data interpretation, right? So, key concepts here when engaging students in these data narratives is thinking about self-perception. Students are beginning to see themselves as analysts of their own growth, right? And contributing, right, to the insights. We are strengthening students' ability to make meaning, right, out of data. So through structured dialogue, and I'm going to share a few instructional routines that can help us guide that dialogue, right? They can identify trends and articulate how behaviors, effort, and context, right, all influence data outcomes. And then the last piece for the students within this audience is to expand their agency, right? So now, students are co-creating their goals, right? And they're not just handed their goals by their teachers or instructors. That middle layer there with the teachers, right? As the teachers, right, we are the designers of our formative practices. So for us, right, these data narratives strengthen formative assessment practices by expanding insight beyond isolated test results, right? So, again, right here, we're thinking about key concepts of building holistic understandings of our students, right? Integrating not just the performance data, but all other types of reflections and observations and surveys, that can make meaning of the data. As teachers, we are also the instructional decision makers, right? So to guide our decisions, right, we need to find these patterns that are revealing conditions that influence the outcomes, right? So, examples that I shared, in the article is like impacts on group work on motivation, right? How does group work, you know, affect intrinsic motivation, right? And in the article, you'll see that we sort of dug into that and we use that as the backbone to, illustrate these data narratives, right? And also for teachers, right, we're thinking about professional collaboration, right? So as educators, right, we want to these narratives support dialogues within our professional learning communities, right? By shifting conversations away from, well, who scored what, who scored where, to now we're talking about, well, what patterns are emerging and what might be influencing them. And then that sort of that third tier, right? Thinking about school leadership, right? They are the cultivators, right? They are the ones who are signing off on these data cultures, right? Many of these decisions or many of these, practices need buy-in from top down, bottom up, and so forth. So school leadership should definitely be an active player in these audiences as well, right? So when you're thinking about like school leadership, right, we don't want to think about data as surveillance, right? But more for growth. Right. So now we're thinking about ideas of strategic improvement, right? Data narratives exploring opportunities for systemic development, right? Rather than ranking. Creating healthy data cultures, right? Modeling active inquiry. And also, once school leadership buys into these data narratives and data cultures, right? Now we have, extra minds working on, the influencing outcomes. The guiding principles, right? So in the article, I outlined three guiding principles, right? The first guiding principle I would say is, oh, sorry, next slide. Yes. So guiding principles to student-centered data practices, right? The first one I love. There are no absolute indicators, right? This is why data science needs to be centered in schools, teaching, learning across the board, right? Every data point carries uncertainty, right? Because of standard error of measurement, right, exists within all assessments. So no assessment perfectly captures a student's true score, right? So having that understanding, right now we can look at data, particularly thinking about maybe outliers as not just in need of intervention, right, or remediation, but now we're inviting those outliers to for further investigation and further inquiry, right? Looking at trends and patterns, not so much as directional, right? But more of, well, looking at it more directional, I would say, not directive, right? That's the way I would like to phrase it. However, also thinking about data conversations as exploratory, right? Further inquiry, not just the end all be all. So typically, and even when I'm engaging students in this practice of understanding that there are no absolute indicators, right? Whether I'm talking to students or teachers or school leaders, I always, put this disclaimer at the, in the forefront of all of my data conversations is that data initiates inquiry, not it does not end it. So it's just the beginning. The second practice I coined quantify the qualitative. So we'll say to make student voice visible in our classrooms and in our school communities, we can systematically quantify the qualitative, right? So now we're talking about through, coding and categorizing, reflection logs, themes and dialogues, analyzing survey responses, right? We're uncovering the conditions that influence performance. So what does this look like in my classrooms, right? I use Likert scales, right, for reflection surveys, thematic coding of maybe student journaling responses, checklists, right, looking for certain behaviors in the classroom, looking for certain, key words within student dialogue, and sentiment tagging, right? Making sure that students are walking away with a clear understanding or lack of understanding, right? But that they are in a space where they are comfortable communicating, right? Where they're sitting with their understanding. And the third practice I say is student-led debriefs, right? So students should be interpreting classroom data through, I said structured, psychologically safe protocols, right? So questions that we ask within these guided guided discussions is, well, what actions will this data compel you to take, right? Or whose experiences are reflected in this data? Whose reflections might be missing, right? Um, naming these factors, I find, opens up pathways, a plethora of pathways to support students, not just within the classroom, right? So we're thinking about helping students positioning themselves to help to seek help, right, and to advocate for their needs or to explore school resources that may promote balance and or well-being, right? For me, these routines, these data practices create opportunities to listen, right, to maybe common stressors, common factors, cultural touch points that identify students who may need additional support, maybe connect them to mathematical learning in a broader sense, right? And just have, larger discussions about health, time management, empathy, inclusion, and belonging. data as a story, not judgment, right? So here we see the data culture cycle, right? So here I generalize the data culture cycle to this four-step approach. However, regardless of how many steps you wish to, turnkey and design your own data culture to include, always keep in mind that the cycle is just that, right? It's always this iterative approach, this iterative process that transfers raw data into meaningful narratives that are student-centered, right? That first step, we say prepare. In the article, I frame this first step with the inquiry of a what if question, right? So when we're preparing, we're asking ourselves questions, what if this leads to that? What if that leads to this, right? We are creating the the path that we're going to channel our cycle through. Right? Step two, the intervention, right? Now we're implementing that targeted instructional shift. Step three, we defined as assessment, right? So this is now where we are, collecting the student artifacts, right? So whether that's assessments, surveys, reflections, dialogues, exit tickets, quizzes, anything, right? This is where we're collecting that. And then the fourth step is the reflection piece. So here's where our professional learning communities can come in. And, based on the feedback that we've received from the students, here we're now identifying the themes and the patterns. We're creating the visual summaries to share with the students and our stakeholders, right? And we're sharing the results with our students for that interpretation. So this cycle, right, sort of builds on this collaborative, learning community, these professional learning communities that we're all a part of, in which educators share findings, troubleshoot challenges, and refine our practices, right? Filling in our toolbox, teacher toolbox. Next slide, please. Student-led debriefs, right? So student-led debriefs are the formative practices, right, where students are interpreting their data alongside teachers, right? So I want to share a quick story regarding, the background to the inspiration and aspiration, right, for these data narratives. So my 10th grade geometry teacher, we'll call him, we'll Mr. J for, uh, nominal purposes. Four times a year at the beginning of every marking period, he would fill up this huge, clear, transparent jug full of candy, right? And it would be like M&Ms, Skittles, jelly beans, whatever. This is however so many years ago. So questions around, sanitary, and sharing of snacks was not necessarily at the forefront of our thinking as 10th graders. However, at the beginning of every quarter, he would fill this jug up with candy, and everybody across his classes had a chance to guess how much candy was in that jug, right? And everybody would be given a little sticky note. You write your name on it, you put your number in, and it would go into, the box. And my teacher, Mr. J, right, would aggregate the data that he collected. And the rules was, the class average, whichever class had the closest average to the accurate number, got half the jug. And whoever the student was who got closest to the accurate number got the other half. And I will never forget in that the first semester. Oh, and also sort of take a step back, at the conclusion of the experiment, he would share something. He would share, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? He would share an overview of everybody's choices and decisions. And I will never forget, and it was also included the box and whiskers chart, right? So, and I will never forget that the first quarter, I located myself within that data that he would share afterwards. And I would say, oh, okay, I'm overestimating, right? Second quarter, I realized that I was overestimating again, right? Based on where I located my response in the general data, right? And then that third quarter, I then began to, utilize the tools of, area, surface area, and, volume and to create a better guess based on the information that I have been collecting over the terms. And that third quarter, right? I remember the date. It was in January. I was the student who got the closest answer, and the answer was 432, right? And that's a number I will never forget, of course. But I was given a half a jug of jelly beans, and as somebody who does not like jelly beans. I gave most of my jelly beans away to classmates, friends, of course, but then I gave the majority of them to my father, who was a huge fan of those. But it was that experience that really allowed me to say, oh, wow, locating myself in data is a powerful thing. And it really brought, sort of sparked my love of math and my passion, right, to pursue and earn degrees in mathematics and data science. So here, I'm sharing a few instruction routines that I implement within my own class to provide these data debriefs with students, right? So like a gallery walk, you can imagine if I create a gallery walk in my classroom, students are walking around and they're looking at, the visualizations of whatever assessment or whatever metrics that we're measuring, right? And they're responding to them, right? And I find that to be a great way to spark dialogue, not just, teacher to student or student to teacher, but student to student, right? As they're walking around and dialoguing amongst themselves, right? Another instructional routine I find to be very useful in these data narratives is I noticed, I wonder, right? Giving the students a visualization and say, what do you notice? What do you wonder, right? This is where the questions come up as far as what's missing here or how much further can the inquiry go? And then a more recent strategy I've infused in my classes is slow reveal graphs, in which I would just give the students maybe just the pattern or the trend itself. And through an iterative approach, I would slowly reveal more components of that visualization, having students, maybe go through that I notice, I wonder routine and, paying attention as renderings are being tweaked and fine-tuned as more information is being given to them. Right. So right here, we're really, sort of the key words that I'm looking at when I think about these instruction routines is, co-creating goals, right? Having teachers and students work on developing next steps, um, giving students the voice, revealing the context behind the trends and the patterns, right? And creating healthy data cultures, right? Not just within, our instructional teams, but also within our individual learners as well. Oh, okay. So, as we are sort of, coming to the conclusion of my talk, I do want to share that, and I'm sure I've communicated this many times throughout our session, but that, data narratives begin with inquiry and are unfolded through this reflection, this iterative reflection aspect. So, when students help interpret the data that represents them, right, assessment now becomes participatory instead of mandatory, right? Well, also mandatory, but participatory
Yes.
in the nature. And, teachers ourselves, right, we gain deeper instructional insight, right, such that we are, now using data to, really make mindful decisions regarding the how we guide our instruction. So data is becoming this story of growth, structure for empathy, catalyst for collaboration, right? And also, overall, a shared responsibility in our schools. And most importantly, students, begin to see themselves not just as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as a co-author in their own journey to become expert learners.
I'm going to give you the award for most quotable webinar speaker we've ever had. Just with like all these beautiful, you should be an author, all the beautiful things that you're saying. I've written down like 16 different things that I've loved that you've said. And so if anyone has any questions for Carl, please put them in the chat. I have a couple that I've already pulled. So I'm just going to go ahead and get going. One of the quotes that you said that I really just, it resonated with me was like the power behind locating yourself in the data. Immediately, I love that, right? I love the visual that paints in my mind and like the students placing themselves within this larger group and, being able to action that. But I'm kind of wondering, have you ever had any adverse reactions to this? Maybe a lower performing student via, this metric that you might be showing might lose motivation when they see themselves at the bottom, or how would you overcome that if it did happen?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, through this, locating oneself in the data, right? It has to be a structured dialogue, right? So through this, what I mean by structure is, I give students maybe sentence stems to begin their response to to where they're located within the data, in a way not to, again, not to cast judgment or to rank, but to provide opportunity to, communicate, what factors are influencing, right, that location, maybe what can be done differently, maybe what's missing, right, from the visualization, what's missing from my placement in that data, in a way that, it's not, again, one that is looking to cast judgment, but to, provide students with the opportunity to, really be mindful and explicit about ways that they can grow themselves, right, as not just learners, but, self-advocates in their communities.
Yeah, I really like that. Okay, we have another question from the chat. Just asking, like, what do you think realistically could be like the youngest grade level band in which you think this would work? Or if you think it's applicable, like K through 12, how would you kind of scaffold it for those younger grades?
Oh yeah, no, great question. So by trade, I'm a high school teacher, so much of my work is based on the 9 through 12 uh, students. However, I would rely on the expertise from, middle school teachers, elementary school teachers to, find ways to maybe, modify, tailor, customize, these ideas of data narratives to think about how, these conversations can be placed within younger students. Maybe the visualizations don't have to be as complex as, thinking about box and whiskers, right? If you're looking at maybe like, younger populations of students, but younger populations of students do understand trends and patterns. They know when the line is going up, they know when the line is going down. And you can create, thinking about question stems and sentence stems, create the starting platform for students to begin communicating and explicitly thinking about uh, that the data and their location in it.
I really like that. I think, what I do know is very common in like elementary classrooms in terms of working with data is is like, like kind of quite large up on the board, sticky notes, like put your sticky note here. And so I think for me, it seems really doable if we're already crafting, and I hope we are crafting kind of this data mindset um, in the younger grades of just extrapolating it one more piece of like, we're not just going to do this if it's, putting up sticky notes of, what your favorite month is or when you were born, but also then relating it to themselves of like how they think that last lesson went and like yeah like having that little I also think it's a wonderful trust building exercise between student and teacher, and I think trust is something that might not be like talked about often in terms of like pedagogical practice, but really when you've earned like that rapport and trust with students, that like willingness to fail, that willingness to try really spikes. So I'm wondering in your experience, like as you've brought students on board with like their own data and the interpretation, have you found like any changes in their relationship to an upcoming test or assessment or, you know, something that might seem scary or cause anxiety from maybe a more traditional approach to this new approach?
Oh yes, yes, very much so. So I would say, um, I mean, thinking and talking at the same time is not my specialty. However, we could say, through these exercises of sort of naming those factors that, influence data and the outcomes of it, right? It allowed students to uh, verbalize, right, sort of their maybe their need for support, or maybe if the student doesn't have the words to communicate, well, why am I here in the data, right? Where, um, maybe another student may have had a better way of framing it that allowed them to now, fully process their location and ways that they can, think more intentionally about their progress and growth. Um, so yeah, I would say from the student aspect, right, having it be a discussion, right, a dialogue allows students a space to, compile the words, compile the language um, that they, that, of the situations that they're in every day. And as an instructor, as a teacher, right, through these dialogues, through these conversations, right, it also allows me to pinpoint and to identify students who may need additional support, may need additional, acceleration in the class, right? So, it all depends on how the students are locating themselves and making sure that resources are available to support those students. And I think your question sort of builds into the larger aspect of these professional learning communities and thinking about the school culture as a whole, right? As these barriers and factors and influences are arising, right, in these dialogues. Right now we can we can bring in wraparound services um, to support to support whatever maybe preventing or influencing their location in the data.
Yeah. Okay, I have a little shift. This is my own personal question. So you talked about the three tiers in terms of like creating and crafting these data narratives and who it, most closely affects. And we obviously have students at the center, and then that informs the teachers. And then that outer tier was talking about school leadership. And I thought I heard you say like, you can use this to tease out patterns and focus on even like strategic planning in terms of like a higher level. Can you either correct me if I heard that wrong or elaborate a little bit more on like what the ideal would be from a school leadership perspective on how to take these data narratives from students and use them to kind of like change direction of the school?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I would say, through the data, through the debriefs, you know, issues and barriers can surface that uh, may be a little too large for myself as the classroom teacher to engage and work to remedy, right, with the students. So in that case, now we're thinking about how is the school's relationship with the community that they're in, right? How can we support that relationship in a way that is, beneficial to our learners? We're incorporating family engagement, family parent engagement, and how can we bring in other stakeholders from the community into the school, into the school community, to really represent what the school is to the community, right? As a staple and as a safe space. And this is just the beginning of how we can surface those challenges or surface those opportunities and bring in, the right people to support a larger data culture in the community.
Wow, I love that. I live in a very small community, and something I've really loved is just like how much the entire community circles and focuses on the school. And I think something like this could build that type of culture even amongst, larger, more metropolitan areas. And I think that's so good for student learning, right? When everything is connected, and you feel the support from all the angles, I think it's a really powerful thing. So, just being aware of time, I'm going to end us on a bit of a lighthearted question. So in your article, you mentioned this like really wonderful slash kind of funny moment when students explained a poor quiz or test or whatever they had taken that went, it seemed pretty poorly, and they all admitted to like staying up and watching some season finale of a show that they were liking. Can you give us any other surprising insights, funny insights that have emerged just in your own personal experience with these data debriefs that you do with the kids?
Yeah, sure. So I would say other higher arching concepts that emerge from these data debriefs include questions around maybe workload balance. The data debriefs gives the students opportunities to say, well, I scored this because I didn't really understand that, right? So, if we can, take some time to maybe revisit, spiral back, or, could you present this in another way, right? So, it really gives the students the ability to again provide that context that will help shape not just their learning, right, but my instructional decisions in the class. And I guess on a more lighter note, other sort of emerging topics were, well, the bus is always late. So, it takes me and I always I always study on the bus, so I don't get enough time to study. Or, it could be it's a plethora of things, but at the end of the day, the students are empowered, right, to share their feedback because it directly correlates to the data, or it directly influences the data in a way that this everybody's on the same page, right? We're all looking to grow. Um, we're not speaking in technical terms. This is very much a human-centered approach to understand what's influencing the young people in our classes to succeed and what we can do to remove any barriers that will can impede on that success.
Okay, so that was the last question, but that made me have a follow-up question, which
Okay.
is, has this shifted at all? I guess like now I'm starting to think about, that reactionary versus like the proactive. Like in my ideal world, I'm not waiting till after I give an exam to hear that they didn't understand the, compound probability. And that's why then they couldn't
Mhm.
build, right? Ideally, I'm like hearing that sooner so that it happens before and I have like what I feel is a better assessment on learning at the end. Have you found that just doing this practice lets students be more vocal, even in an undocumented, like not a data formal survey, but they'll just be more willing to like speak up in class as a whole if they're like struggling or like kind of sharing. the context of where they're at before you do one of these?
Oh yes, yes, very much so. I would say if you go back to one of the first slides, I would say I believe it's slide 6,
Oh, sorry.
right? Oh, there we right, perfect. So if you look at the particularly the top two examples, you know, data narratives don't have to wait until an assessment, right? Like for example, the circle chart was just a problem that I gave to the students as an exit ticket, right? And I what I noticed through observing the student work is that there were a multitude of ways that the students went about solving that particular problem. And I thought it was really important for me to share, to sort of, bring that to light for the students such that, for example, you see the no work shown was a larger group in the class than I would have liked to. So, showing that no work shown, showing that group of students that, well, there are several ways you can attack this problem, and uh, it's really your choice, right? So it's whatever you feel comfortable with, but just staying within the rules of the game we call mathematics. So
Yeah,
it doesn't happen just within the structured assessment. It happens all along the way as well.
gotcha. Okay, that's good. I like that. Okay. I am going to wrap us up. I think, if Carl has inspired you tonight, he certainly has for me. But you're not quite sure like how to, do this a little bit more purposefully or with intention, please feel free to reach out to us at Data Science for Everyone. You can join our Slack, newsletter, LinkedIn, Twitter. We have a bunch of different ways to get in contact with us, and we can help you um, and be that bridge between maybe where you're at in your own data narrative journey and where the expert is with Carl showing us the way here. And then a couple other things is if you want to go check out our resource center, we have a data science starter kit in case you are hoping to expand data science education in your own classrooms. We have some data sets, we have great lessons. Our data science learning progressions available at datasciencelearning.org has a lot of different resources for you there. And I think with that, I'm going to say thank you so much, Carl. I will be following up with you for a couple things, I think, because I loved our discussion today. And everyone, thank you for joining. Our webinar in March is going to feature a junior in high school and her teacher who were published in a very prestigious science journal for a big data science project that they did last year. So if you are interested in seeing what can a high school student do, turns out probably better than my PhD thesis, and I'm really excited to showcase that. So everyone have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining. We'll make sure to get this recording out as well as all the resources onto our Slack channel and our emails. So have a great night. Thank
Thank you,
you,
everybody.
Carl.
Have a great
I
night.
really loved the talk.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure and honor to be here today.
Awesome. Have a great night.